Hi everyone, welcome to data visualization. This week's topic is talking about encodings, and when it comes to data visualization, the term encodings, we refer to how we encode our data into some sort of visual property. So basically what we're going to be talking about are the visual properties that we can choose and why we might choose some over others for different situations. So these are the learning outcomes for this week. As per usual, we're going to have a few different good versus bad visualizations, so good and bad examples of different visualizations that are out there. So this one here is showing the gross domestic product, so the GDP. So that's a monetary measure of market value, and in this instance it's all the final goods and services produced in a particular time period. So you can see in this one here now the x-axis has the timeline, and you can see that things aren't evenly spaced out on there. So obviously whatever the kind of data set that they have chosen a particular timeline and the spacing of the time. So 1 to 1,000 is in the very first one. Obviously not much data there. So what you can see here, interestingly, this is like a stacked area chart, and we've said that these are kind of difficult to get very specific or exact values. But what you can see here are kind of bigger picture trends. So if we look at the very start, we can see the countries that had the most share of the world's GDP were India and China. So at this time, they would have had the biggest economies, and you can see that they had the biggest share of the market then. And we can also see that the United States, which are in green there, don't come into play until 1700. So another point of interest is around 1950. If you see here, you can see that there's a big pinch kind of, so, and an effect that we see at the bottom in the United States, but you can see this traveling up. So there's a big jump for countries like the UK, some of the European countries, and India and Germany as well. So that's an interesting part here. And then if we look at the most recent ones, that's up at 2008, you can see that the US then has looks like around 20% of the world's GDP. And something to think about with this is the populations that are contained in these countries. Okay, so the next one is a visualization that might be useful for you when it comes to the assignment, actually. So I have a link to the data that was used for this visualization. So this was carried out by the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. And it's an index that they have developed. So they've collected a load of data from women all around the world, and it assesses factors like inclusion and justice and security. So they've asked women in each of these countries how secure do they feel, how included in their community. So inclusion looks at things like their achievements in education, employment, parliamentary representation, and things like access to financial services or mobile phones and things like that. There's another index that they combine for justice, and that looks about any kind of discrimination against women in the legal system, so kind of measuring a bias in favor of sons, and that is also looking at equality in the workplace, so pay equality, I guess. The final index that they measure is security. So this is security at the family, community and societal level. So it looks at things like violence from a partner, or perception of safety within their community, or to allow mobility and opportunities for women outside the home. So really nice data set, a lot of work, and combined a lot of stuff in it too. The visualization itself is quite good. So some of the things that I want to point out here are the data that's scored. So we don't have an axis, an x-axis. We have a ranking here on the very left. So that's the countries that have the highest scoring index. So each, that justice, security and inclusion, they all combine together to give this number. So the first number is for Iceland, and it's 0.886. So the countries are ranked from the best to the worst. So what they've done in this in this example is they have used colour quite effectively. So we can see green is good, red is bad. We can see that there's a contrast between the grey of the background and the grey of the numbers, but the main thing that they want to stand out is the actual index itself. So we can see the ranking of the countries. Another thing that they've done that's quite nice is the way that they've divided it up. So they have the 5 best countries, the 5 worst countries, and they've also picked a country in the middle. So in this instance, they wanted a focus point and they chose the United States for that. So they indicate, they can highlight a point of focus too. So if you were doing this for Ireland, you might have an Ireland as the number there. Incidentally, Ireland was number 19 overall. So we were quite good for discriminatory norms. They have things like but they do have a problem with the legal system, that there is an element of sun bias. The US is 22, probably because of things like maternity leave or a lack of paid maternity leave and stuff like that. So, but they've also, the visualization itself uses the direct labels because I guess the value that we're measuring against 0 to 1 is a small one. It's important to have accuracy, and there's a lot of information on the page, so actually taking away the grid and the axis makes the information more relevant. The presence of the flags, in my opinion, isn't necessary, but they obviously are wanting to draw attention to that too, because that's in colour where everything else is in black and white. Another nice idea for visualization is this one at representing a number of cities in the US. So you can see here it's kind of like a flower representation, and each petal of the flower represents one of the major sports leagues, so basketball, baseball, hockey and football. And then the size of each of the petals then represents the number of times the city has won the league. So you can see here that there are some cities that have, if you need to actually click on the link because you can't really read it from here, but there's one there that has quite a large kind of pink petal and one that has another yellow one. You can see if you look at the second from the bottom over on the right hand side, I think that's New York City, and they're quite well represented. So some cities focus on 1 or 2 sports, others try to have each of them. So it's a nice kind of high level overview. Again, you're not going to have very specific exact levels of detail, but it gives a bigger picture. Here's another one that's quite famous that you probably have come across before if you've looked at visualizations, and it is one representing the age of Leonardo DiCaprio from 1999 up till last year, and also graphing the ages of his girlfriend at the time. So quite a lot of information, and the reason that this is a nice visualization, so whether or not you choose to have a black background and the contrasting foreground from that is different, but they're actually representing and kind of an extra dimension with the girlfriend name, but they've made it quite easy and intuitive to use. So we have Leonardo's age as one dimension, and then the years as time has gone on as a second dimension, but we've also added a third dimension in here, tracking the age of his girlfriend at the time, so in the blue. So it's a nice example of adding a third dimension without confusing or adding clutter to a graph. Okay, and referring back then to the example that we have of the petals, here is a bad representation of that. So if we contrast it to the one that I put forward as a good visualization, this one here has too many dimensions represented on the petals. There's no text to describe what is being represented, what any of the petals represent. There is overlap. If you look at countries like Slovenia and Spain they're overlapping. So the idea is similar, and there's obviously another dimension being measured too, perhaps an overall dimension by the height of each country on the graph. So yeah, so a bad example matching the one that we had a minute ago. Okay, so The notes from today then, I just want to talk about the use of encodings. As I said, it's the first. There's another part next week, another section, or in 2 weeks' time, going into a little bit more detail. But just for today, we're going to have an overview of the different encodings available and when you might choose to use one type of encoding over another. So the first thing you need to know before you start deciding on how to encode your data is you need to be aware of the kind of data that it is. So this is where the data types classification comes into consideration. I'm sure you already know this, I'm not going to spend too long, but there are different categories or classifications of data types. So the first is categorical, so there's no order, and this is things like city names, types of diseases, I don't know, different brands or something like that. The next step of ordered, I guess, is ordinal. So again, this is a qualitative type of data. So things are ordered, but they're more in a rank rather than anything numerical or measurable. So first, second, third, cold, warm, hot. The days of the week, because that represents a progression of the week. You can have things like educational background or something like that too. So there is a kind of a step implied, but it's not measured. We also have quantitative data, so integers or reals. So we can have integers or floats. And of quantitative data, we have ratio and numerical real data. So a ratio would be something like measuring heights. So if a number is truly numerical, you'll be able to have 0 meaning 0, and you will also have negative values. But something like height doesn't have those factors. So there's no such thing as a negative height. So yeah, so here's an overview then of the data type. So categorical is text or nominal, ordinal has some sort of ranking, or temporal data can also be ordinal because 0 doesn't mean true 0 as we've come to know it. And then there's quantitative types such as interval, which is, as I said, measurements of height or things like that. And then we have true ratio, which is where 2 is equals to 2 times 1, 0 means 0, and we have negative values as well. Okay, so so data representation is the act of giving visual form to your data. What we need to do is encode the data in such a way so that viewers can decode whatever shapes, positions, colors that we use in order to be able to get an understanding of what values they represent of the data you're trying to convey to them. So it's a two-step process. You have to do the reverse through encoding, assigning properties to values, making sure that they're intuitive, that they're understandable, and then the user has to decode that to determine meaning for a data set that you're going to present to them. So when we look at visual encoding of data, there are two main aspects of it that we have to think about, marks and attributes. So marks are the points or lines or areas of what we're talking about, and then the attributes are the appearance of these, so the size, the color, the position of them. And then the objective of visual encoding is to find the right combination of marks and attributes that will most effectively portray the angle of analysis that you want to show your viewers. And that angle of analysis refers back to what we talked about last week. And I guess the main thing that you need to do is to choose the correct recipe of these marks and attributes, as well as other components, so your axes, your grid lines, and these will form an anatomy of a chart, and your job is to make the decoding as easy as possible for the user so they can spend more time finding out what it is that they want to get from this data. Okay, so as I said, in visual encoding combines marks and attributes together. So marks are really simple. It's just what you're choosing to represent your data as, whether that's a point, whether it's a line or an area or a form. So a point is something like a scatter plot. A line might be one linear spatial dimension like a line graph, You might choose 2 different dimensions, such as area, or you might choose 3 different dimensions. So there are loads of different attributes that you can choose to change, so the appearance properties of these different marks. So we won't have time to go through every single one possible. I'm sure there's something new will come up by the time I finish this lecture, but things that we'll talk about a lot are position, size, and then there are 3 properties of color that you can change. So we've talked about this before. Maybe you choose different symbols or shapes, different patterns, things like the angle or the slope. So that's, I guess, dependent on of your axis as well. So something that we're going to talk about a little bit later on is an idea called distinct values. And if we look at this table here and we look at the very column to the very right, this is kind of linked to useful values. So how many distinct values does a particular marker attribute have that your user is going to be able to, first of all, see the difference between, second of all, differentiate it between something else, and third of all, remember it. So if we look at something like, okay, so position and placement has infinite numbers because there are infinite, I guess, hierarchies of details. So text labels is infinite as well. Length has many because we're quite good actually at judging differences in length. Size and area has many too, but you might want to be careful with that because too many things on a chart might remove the effectiveness of it. But if we look at something like color, we know that there are nearly infinite different colors in the world because we can combine RGB values and get infinite combinations of those, or not infinite, but a very, very high number of those. But how many colors can we distinctly tell the difference between? So if we're using color, which is the hue, so that's your pink, purples and all that kind of thing, there's actually not that many colors that we can tell the difference between and perceive when they're face to face. So definitely less than 20. We'll talk about some more specific guidelines for that again. Things like shapes or icons, medium as well, we're not going to be able to just differentiate between them. Same goes for patterns. And then things like enclosure or connection, that's fine because that's kind of a yes or no. It's almost like a binary interpretation that we have to have. Okay, so as well as the number of distinct values that we have, we also have to think about kind of intrinsic meaning or natural orders that come along with them. So some properties of visual encoding have a meaning that we must be aware of as designers, and some don't. So if we think about density or intensity, so generally something is darker, it usually means that there's more of it. So if we look at population, it's not usually the case that we will see a low population associated with the darker color. It usually goes darker is more. Same for size, length or area, larger is equal to more, not the other way around. Certainly for the English language, left is usually first and top is usually first. Other languages, this might not always be the case. But then if we look at hue or color, there's no intrinsic meaning to hue. So purple doesn't mean more than green, for instance. So here's a really good reference table. There are other examples out there. You could do a little bit of research yourself, but so depending on the kind of data that you have, the type of data that you're representing, the number of data points that you want to represent, that might help you choose the different types of attributes to vary or to place in a chart. Here's another way of representing that. So this is actually linking it to the different data types themselves. So if we look at the categorical, which is the green square there, we can see that for categorical data, we've position and placement, color, patterns, shapes, text, and enclosure. So that's whether things are part of a group or not. If you want to represent relational data, so that's talking about data from you're visualizing things with relationships like data flow programs or entity relationship diagrams, flow charts, decision maps, that kind of stuff. So there's a number of different options available for that too. And then you have the ordinal and quantitative data types as well. Okay, so I've touched on a couple of these already, but these are the main considerations that you have to take into account when you're choosing an appropriate visual encoding method. The first is natural ordering, distinct values, which we've talked about already, whether to use something that's tried and tested and potentially a little bit repetitive, or whether you try to do something completely innovative. You need to be aware of who your audience is and the context of what the reader has, their life, their knowledge, their culture. You need to make things compatible with reality, so don't kind of go against intuitive aspects, so like representing data on airplanes up higher than data from the sea or something like that. And then patterns and consistency, and this is something that I see a lot of in assignments, is a lack of consistency across things. So natural ordering is when there's an order or a ranking assigned to the values of a visual property. This is determined subconsciously by the mechanics of our visual system. So if you think of your visual system as almost like software, so the software that kind of decides whether something is a natural order or not is deeply embedded in our brains. It's not optional. It's not something that you can design around. You need to be aware of it and you need to design around that. You can't change somebody's knowledge or perception of what is a natural order. So the process is deeply embedded in our understanding and evaluates relative order independent of language, culture, or convention. So we'll talk about culture and convention a bit later, but this natural ordering is something that just exists. It's automatic, unintentional, and we can't avoid it. Depending on the specifics of the visual property, its natural ordering may be well suited to representing quantitative differences or ordinal differences. So position has a natural ordering in that we said the left is usually the first, or the top is usually first. If we position something above something else, we presume that it is a higher ranking, a higher value, whereas shape does not. A triangle does not mean more than a square. Length has a natural ordering. Obviously, the longer, the more values we associate with it. Texture doesn't, but pattern density does. So we can assume that the denser a pattern is, the more or the larger a value it represents. Line thickness or weight has a natural ordering, but line style does not. Again, you could kind of maybe put forward the case that whether it's solid, dotted, or dashed, the amount of white space, say, in a line might be representing something. But I guess things like colour and shape don't, but length and position and line thickness do. So yeah, so colour is not ordered. So if we look at this visualization here, which is a map showing different altitudes across different parts of Europe. So the lowest altitude is purple and the highest altitude is red, represented in this. But actually it's kind of difficult to map heights or to interpret just looking at this graph where the high areas are. We're a little used to seeing colour being misused, so it doesn't go against our knowledge base, for instance, but it's not appropriate and it certainly makes more work. So in this instance, is green lower than light blue, lower than dark blue? And it's not. So dark blue is actually lower and then green is higher. So it's kind of hard to know which of those colours. So colour hue isn't naturally ordered in our brains, but things like brightness, so the lightness or the luminance of something, and saturation is. So, and we also have strong social conventions about colour. So hue talks about the tone of the colour, so blue, orange, yellow. Brightness talks about how light or how dark a colour it is, so going from black to white. And then intensity is how strong the colour is, so whether it's like grey tone to like a pure, very vivid colour with high saturation. So the misuse of colour to imply order is rampant, as we saw in that previous example. If you want to use colour to encode an ordering, so if you want to use it for elevation or heat maps, vary the brightness or the saturation. So make a colour go from a much lighter colour to a much darker colour, or go more from a grayscale to a very vivid red, for instance, or something like that. So rather than cycling through the rainbow, represent elevation by increasing the darkness of the brown. So instead of this example, something like this is a bit more intuitive. So we're kind of, even here we're going from green to brown, but we are only asking the user to cycle through one, axis or dimension of colour. So we talked about distinct values already. So when choosing a visual property, select one that has a normal of useful differentiable values and an ordering similar to that of your data. So before you go making a chart or a graph, look at the amount of data points that you have, and based on that, that will help you limit the type of encoding that you're going to use. So plenty of colours out there in the world, but we can't tell them apart if they're too similar. But we can much more easily differentiate a large number of shapes, positions, and numbers. So again, back to this table. When you're choosing your encoding mechanisms, go back and refer to this table or the other example that I had. Okay, so there are loads of default encodings and conventions in the world with good reason. So designing new encoding formats can cost you a lot of time and effort. They might also make your reader spend a lot more time and effort to learn what it is that you're trying to say to them. So knowing the defaults that are expected for your industry, the data type, or the reader can save you a lot of work when it comes to figuring out how to encode the data and how you might explain that encoding to your readers. So the downside, so defaults make your life a lot easier because you can use ready-made examples. They make the reader's life a little bit easier because it's easier for them to interpret something that's familiar for them. So sometimes using the same pattern or the same encoding mechanism time and time again can put the readers to sleep. Sometimes it can help them to understand your message much quicker. So it all depends on maybe how many visualizations or how much information you're trying to get across, how much work you're expecting of the user on the other side. In writing, we'll often advise each other to stay away from cliches or from repetitiveness. We want the reader to really think about what we're saying, and cliches tend to turn the brain off. But in visualization, that kind of brainlessness can actually be a help rather than a hindrance. So it can make comprehension and understanding a lot more efficient. So conventions or default formats can be your friend. So I guess it depends on the situation, maybe how understanding or how complicated a topic it is that you're trying to display, and I guess how clear your message is as well. So if you have a superior solution, then use it. But if your job can be done well enough with the default format, save everyone the effort and use a standard solution. So I guess it depends on what it is that you want to say, how clear your message is, and how easy to understand it's going to be if you use a different type of visualization format. The next one talks about the reader's context. So this is about your audience. You're creating a visualization for someone who's not you. The reader might have a different mindset or view the world differently to you. And your audience is probably going to be more than one reader. For me, for your assignments, it's just one reader. So you can assume my level of knowledge, but in general, you're designing a visualization for an audience of more than one. And each of these people are individuals. They're going to be different from each other. They're going to be different from you. They're going to have, different backgrounds, different levels of interest in what it is that you're trying to tell them. So it's not always going to be possible to take into account the preconceptions or the knowledge of all of your readers. So what you want to do is choose the most important group, think of them as your core group, and design with them in mind. So where it's possible to appeal to more people without sacrificing precision or complexity or efficiency, do so. And then you can think of a reader as a representative reader from your core audience. So something else that you have to think about then is conventions and cultural associations. So we talked about colour earlier, and we said that colour doesn't have meaning in terms of value, but there are very, very strong conventions and cultural associations that we have with colour. So this can be also specific to a country. So if you lived in the United States and you looked at a visualization that had a red and a royal blue colour scheme, you'll definitely associate that more with Republicans and Democrats, whereas we don't really have that association with our political parties in this country. Other cultures, some colours may be lucky, some may be considered unlucky, or have, positive or negative connotations. In India, some colours are associated with different life events. We might think sometimes of pink and blue referring to boys and girls. Red, yellow or green might be traffic signals. Colours can also take on another significance when they're paired with particular shapes, like a red octagon means stop. So even if you saw that on the road and you don't speak the language, you'll understand what it means. Or as I said, that pairing with other colours like the red and blue for the Democrats or Republicans. So something like this, even if you don't speak French, you know what sign means. Okay, something else you have to consider when it comes to your readers is perhaps the reader might suffer, or one of your readers might suffer from a disorder of colour blindness. So this can actually manifest itself in a number of different ways, and it's more properly called colour vision deficiency or dyschromatopsia. So 7 or 8% of men suffer with some sort of colour perception disorder. So you do have to think about it and try to make your visualizations as accessible as possible, regardless of who they are. So there can be different types of deficiency, so it can be red-green or yellow-blue, but red-green is the most common by far. So this link here is to an app where you can select colour swatches in a group and simulate how they are perceived with a number of different types of dyschromatopsia. So it just allows you to understand how your colour scheme might be perceived by people with different perception disorders. The other thing to be aware of is your reader's context in terms of their culture. So is the reader from a culture that reads left to right, right to left, or top to bottom, or the other way around? Their reading habits or patterns will determine their default eye movements over page, and that should guide you in terms of the ordering that you should replace particular data points in a graph. It will also affect what they perceive to be earlier or later. And something else that we might always see is that in geographic maps, a map of the world, we're really familiar with seeing the perspective of kind of Europe in the center. So the US is over to the left hand side. We have Australia down the bottom left hand side. But depending on where you are or where your reader is from in the world, that's not always going to be the most appropriate one. So Stuart MacArthur has developed a new map projection or perspective called the South Up map, which puts Australia towards the center top of it, just for kind of correcting the distortion effect. So whatever is placed in the center looks bigger than the ones at the edges, or seems to be more important. Oh, I just added a link in here for different colour associations for different colours or for different cultures. that was actually sent to me by a student last term, and might for you for your assignment. So this is MacArthur's map here, where we can see Australia plays a much more central role. We have the US and the Americas then on the right hand side, and Europe is kind of split across the two edges, which we're not usually familiar with seeing that perspective on the world. So I also talked about making your visualization compatible with reality for the user. So make the encodings of things in your relationships as well aligned as possible with your reader's reality, I suppose, more than anything, of those relationships. So if you're representing, I don't know, different shapes, if you're representing shapes of trucks or cars, generally trucks are bigger than cars, so try to use that ordering. Different objects will have different colors, well-known locations, and other identifying characteristics. So what you want to do is just basically make life as easy for your user as possible. You don't want to conflict with these things. You want to go along with them and to fit in with them as much as possible. So if you were representing a visualization where you had boats placed above planes, that doesn't make sense. So I'll have some sort of ordering or realism to it. So align it with reality as much as you can. So if you were doing a visualization with boats and planes, generally the planes would be up in the sky and the boats would be on the water or in that level. So while you don't want to rely heavily on social conventions or these cultural differences or associations that we have, you can't guarantee that they're going to get your message across without help and completely consistency. So you can't rely on them in place of other, legends or aids, but you certainly can't go against them. So what you want to do is just avoid countering conventions where possible, to avoid creating cognitive dissonance where somebody has to go back and forth to the legend and kind of reread things a few times. So you want to avoid a clash of what we're used to seeing, so habitual interpretation, and the underlying message you're sending. So things you might think about are spatial representations, what left and right means politically, so where you might place certain data points. The significance of above or below might be another thing. Now, on to consistency and patterns. So as a designer, we have to be very deliberate about the patterns that we create, and more importantly, the pattern violations. So the human brain is really good at identifying patterns in the world. We can really easily recognize things like similarities in shapes, positions. Like if you look at a scatter plot, it's quite intuitive for us to see patterns emerging, cyclical patterns, colors. We have patterns in rhythm, language, behavior. So this ability to recognize patterns is really powerful because it allows us to identify stimuli that we've seen before. And hopefully we can use that then to predict or to depend on this to predict behavior for based on what we've seen before. So as a result of our acute ability to recognize patterns, we're also really highly tuned to violations of patterns. So if you do something in one way in visualization number 1 and you do it in a different way, so you use a different color palette or you use red to represent something else, that's going to stand out, be quite obvious, and appear to have been done. People will assume that you've done it on purpose to make some sort of a point. So people will notice patterns and assume they are intentional. So when they notice patterns, so the same color scheme used, they will expect it to be the same, and they will expect any kind of violations of that to be meaningful and to have been done on purpose. So 3 simple rules about patterns and consistency. So be consistent in the membership, ordering, and other encodings. Things that are the same should look the same, and things that are different should look different. So you just have to try and be as consistent as you can. And it's probably a good idea to be deliberate. So if you kind of go through the process of very deliberately choosing your marks and attributes, at the outset, it becomes a little bit easier because you'll have already kind of gone through the decision-making process early on, and then you can just follow that through. Okay, so that is the list, I suppose, of the considerations when it comes to choosing an appropriate visual encoding. We'll talk a bit more about the different types of encodings themselves in the next lecture. So I also just wanted to briefly talk about this week's lab. So this week's lab is looking at OR, and it's a set of exercises to be carried out in OR. It's one of the graded labs as well, so it's important that you get this done and demo it to me. If you can't demo it to me this week, you can demo it to me next week or in the coming weeks, maybe just at some point before the end of term. As I've said, I will grade any labs at any stage, so it is important that you go along with these labs. They're there, and I'm giving you grades so that it can help you when it comes time to doing the assignment. I know a lot of you will be working on the assignment 1 in Tableau at the moment, but it's still important to follow and keep up with these labs. So in this lab, I actually go through a set of steps, so you can kind of follow through some exercises at the start of the lab and then answer the questions. So use OR to answer the questions below. So the main packages that we're using in OR are ggplot and SQLDF. You don't have to use SQLDF. If you prefer to do the data wrangling yourself using OR commands, that's fine too. So there are some examples here of how to go about creating. If you haven't used OR before, I also have a tutorial on Brightspace. It's worth going through that and making sure that you follow through the commands and that you can do simple things like setting up a plot. So in this instance, we're setting up the myplot+ command adds particular geometry to a chart. So you first of all have to declare a plot. So you define a plot, ggplot, you give it a data set, the x-axis and the y-axis that you want, and then you can begin to add geometry to that plot once you've initialized it. So the command geomapplot creates a scatter plot. We can also add a point, and we can assign a property to be used as differentiating. So in this instance, we've chosen color. You can also use a color palette. So Scale Fill Brewer. We'll talk about Color Brewer next week, but it's an app where you can have a particular color palette chosen for you. So in this instance, we're choosing a red color palette. And the last one here is you can customize colors manually. So you can either do it automatically or you can manually assign different colors to different values. Okay, so in this example, we have the examples of extra layers. So an example of adding a map, so a coordinate map. So you have to choose a projection. Again, in the coming weeks, we'll talk about the different type of projections that are there and where to center the map around. You can have a look in OR at the different packages and the different themes that they have, add labels to it, and you can also create small multiples based on a particular dimension using the facet wrap command. Okay, so yeah, there are a number of questions that I want you to answer in the lab. So what are the average results in written exams across all subjects and all years per student? What are the average results in oral exams across all subjects and years per student? What are the average results in the written exams per student and year? So you have to do a little bit of data wrangling. You have to do averages across different columns or represent an average. You have to create a number of custom functions in order to get things like averages. You might have to get overall results. If you're given written and oral exams, you might create another column with the overall results. So here are the questions, each worth 2 marks for a total of 10 for the lab. So what are the total marks for each student for each subject? So the questions will tell you the dimensions that I want represented. So I want the total marks. So I don't want oral and written. I just want an average for each student for each subject. So there are 3 students and there are a number of different subjects. So I want each of those represented. what's the relationship between age and mark. So I want age on one axis and mark on another axis. So you have 3 students again, or some people represent this age per year. So they might go, because I think there's a number of different years represented. So I don't mind how you do that once the age and the mark are on the different axes. Did any students do better on the written compared to their oral? So in this instance, this is a bit more complicated because you have to find out whether the written or the oral one was less or more than the other. So you can either do that as a positive or negative around the origin or the 0 on the x-axis, or you can do a subtraction and represent that. Which subject obtained the best results on average? So I literally just want the 5 subjects or whatever there is on the x-axis and a very average one. And important as well that on the y-axis, when you're representing a result, because you have a number of different students and a number of different years, I want the average result. So I want, if I'm asking you for a value, it has to be between 0 and 100 on the x-axis. So make sure you average across what you need to average across. And then the 5th question here is, what are the average results in all exams across all subjects and all years per student? So I want the average result per student. So each student, so 1, 2, 3 on the x-axis, and then the average result again between 0 and 100 on the y-axis.